Chapter 8, um, Setting Up a Moral System, Basic Assumptions and Basic Principles. Now, in this chapter, Dr. Thoreau tries to deal with a number of issues that have been up to now unresolved. Um, they say up to now. I think we're still going to find that they're unresolved when we're done with this. But he's going to try to synthesize all of these various systems that we've talked to in order to come up with a personalized moral code. Um, but these various systems include consequentialism and non-consequentialism, self and others, um, act and rule, reason versus emotion, absolute versus relative, universal to particular. Now, these are some of the most basic roles of ethics, and the lack of closure will no doubt have left some of you frustrated and disappointed. Well, welcome to ethics. Welcome to philosophy. There is no black and white. Things seem to be various shades of gray. Not 50 shades of gray, but various shades of gray. Now, to address this problem, Thoreau proposes to state and justify 5 basic principles that form the basis for what he calls humanitarian ethics. So he is going to synthesize all of this information and come up with something that's satisfying to him. And you can do the same thing. You can boil this down and come up with your own system of ethics, something that you will use in your everyday life. Now, we're talking about some conflicts that we've had, conflicting general moral sense. First of all, we'll start with consequentialism versus non-consequentialism. Now, we have to consider the consequences of our decisions, of our acts and rules, but at the same time, we need to be aware of and to avoid the end justifies the means problem. So basic concern for consequences in any moral system, but we need to remember that the end doesn't justify the means. Kant and his system was very specific, saying that people are a means, or excuse me, people are an end in and of themselves. And so we need to remember that. And then self versus other interestedness. There are problems associated with a totally self-interested basis for morality. Therefore, the utilitarian approach of doing what is in the best interests of everyone seems to be the best approach at times, anyway. We need to bring about the best consequences for all, and that includes ourselves. We do count. Ethical egoism is a problem because that's all we're worried about. But in reality, we do need to be worried about ourselves. I don't know if you've read or watched Hamlet, but there is a tremendous soliloquy, to Laertes by his father Polonius. And I'm going to read this because it directly addresses this. Yet here, Laertes, aboard for shame. The wind sits in the shoulder of your sail, and you are stayed for. There, my blessing with thee. For these few precepts in thy memory, see thou character. Give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought its act. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. Those friends thou hast, and their adoption tried, grapple them to thy soul with hoops of steel, but do not dull thy palm with entertainment of each new-hatched, unfledged comrade. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but, being in it, bear that the opposed may beware of thee. Give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. Costly thy habit as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy, rich, not gaudy, for the apparel oft proclaims the man, and they in France of the best rank and station are of a most select and generous chief in that. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for a loan oft loses both itself and friend. And borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This, above all else, to thine own self be true. And it must follow, as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Farewell, my blessing season in thee. That's tremendous, because it's saying, above all other things, you need to be true to yourself. It doesn't matter what the world thinks, what the world does. It does matter that you're able to look at yourself in the mirror. Act versus rule. In a moral system, we require freedom to act and yet also stability and order, rule. The act approach allows for more freedom. Rule allows for more stability. We need both. Try to synthesize these, use them together, make them work. Emotion versus reason. In a moral system, we require reason without excluding emotion. A system needs to be based on reason, but we need to remember that one element of being human is that we have emotion. We have will and we have emotion. We need to utilize both. Now, what constitutes a workable and livable moral system? There are some basic assumptions. I'm going to give you 5. 1, it must be rationally based. 2, it must be logically consistent. 3, it must be universal or general in its application to everyone. And yet, it needs to be applicable in a practical way to both individuals and individual situations. It needs to be teachable, and it needs to be able to resolve conflicts. Up to this point, you see that none of these systems really seem to be able to resolve conflicts. Now, that's a problem if it's going to be practical, if it's going to be usable, if it's going to be teachable. We need the ability to resolve conflicts. So let's talk about including rational and emotional aspects. First of all, emotion. Human beings are both rational and emotional. I'm older than most of you, but Star Trek was one of my very, very, very favorite shows. And in the show, you got Mr. Spock. Let me get to there. Yes, Jim, everything must be logical. And then you've got Captain Kirk, who is always trying to talk about emotion. So here you got Kirk, and here you have Spock, and you've got to make both of them work together. Shatner was always like, Spock, you've got to understand, we're not just logical creatures, we're human. And Nimoy was always like, yes, Jim, logic rules overall. Well, we've got to combine both of those things together. I know, really bad impressions, but really fun. We need to have fun with whatever we're doing. But moral issues have an emotional dimension. But we can't make moral decisions solely based on emotion. You just can't do that. Feelings are too unreliable and individualistic. And another basis that's fair and more objective is needed. Rational thought is needed. Reason should guide the emotion and yet recognize the prominent role that emotion plays. Reasoning implies several things. It implies a logical argument. It implies logical consistency. Now, there are formal rules for reasoning that all can learn that will support decisions that we make. Reason is a power. Reasoning is the exercise of that power. That's one of the things that we want to learn in this class, is how to support the decisions that we make logically and rationally. Now, a certain detachment from feelings is necessary. It's implied. This springs from reasoning's formality, which forces one to consider the truth and validity of what the individual and others are thinking and saying. It is a common means by which differences in feelings, opinions, and thoughts can be arbitrated. Logical consistency is necessary because it creates stability within a moral system. But a moral system that says something can never in any situation be done morally is too rigid. Therefore, we must strive for logical consistency and yet allow enough flexibility to ensure that the system remains applicable. It must be universal. Morality that attempts to help all human beings relate meaningfully must strive to possess universal applicability. Um, must be broad-based enough to include as many as possible, and yet it must apply to the particular. One's moral system should not become so generalized and abstract that it cannot be applied to particular situations and individuals. It needs to be able to be taught, and I should add, promulgated. It must be teachable. It must be practical. If any moral system is to be applied to more than one person, it must be able to be promulgated. That is, laid out for people to see and understand. And it should also be teachable so that others can learn about it regardless of whether they wish to accept or reject it. The ability to resolve conflicts. If a system can't decide between interests, then it isn't useful. It isn't practical. A workable moral system must be able to resolve conflicts among duties and obligations, and even among its participants. If a moral system or theory proposes a series of duties and obligations that human beings ought to perform or be responsible for, yet fails to tell people what they should do when these conflicts arise, then the entire theory is thrown into doubt. Some basic principles, some individual freedom and their justification. The problems of morality center essentially around two areas: how to attain unity and order by working with basic principles so as to avoid the chaos of situationism and intuitionism, and how to allow individual and group freedom to work with such principles meaningfully. Can we cut across all of the principles of each system to distill our own basic principles? Sure, we can. But we have some problems. And the first problem that we're going to run into is how many? Um, Thoreau asks, how about something like the golden rule? This can't be our only principle since others must or might want different things than we do. And yet, I would say to you that the golden rule is as universal as anything that I can think of. It doesn't matter what religion, denomination that you adhere to, in some form or another, the golden rule exists in Buddhism and in Islam and Christianity, and yet, as Thoreau points out, it's asking that we treat others the way that we would want to be treated. And while that is a good thing, we need to take into account maybe others don't want to be treated the way that we would like to be treated. Also, it doesn't tell us what to do. It only provides a basis for evaluating what we've chosen to do. So, some individual principles that Thoreau feels are required for any moral system, and especially for his. But here they are. The value of life principle states that human beings should revere life and accept death. The principle of goodness or rightness is ultimate to any moral system, and it requires that human beings attempt to do three things. One, promote goodness over badness and to do good. Two, uh, cause no harm or badness, which seems like it's the same as to promote goodness over badness, but it's not. And the third, prevent badness or harm. Now, when we talk about the value of life system, are we talking about all life or are we talking about human life? All ethical systems concern themselves with the value of at least some lives. Justification of the value of life principle is fairly simple. Life is basic. Without life, no good can occur, no bad can occur. Um, Individuals have a right to life based on that. And it is empirically, that is, with your senses, with your intellect, it can be proven. The principle of justice and fairness. This is distributive justice, meaning that human beings should treat other human beings justly and fairly when attempting to distribute good and bad among them. Theories about and ways of distributing good and bad have been fully described in Chapter 6. Human beings should treat others justly and fairly. If goods are to be shared, they should be shared justly. Each should have an equal opportunity to acquire those goods. We need to recognize equality and yet allow for individual difference. There are two ways of establishing the priority of the five moral principles. In the first, or general way, the principles are classified into two major categories based upon logical and empirical priority. First category, value of life principle, because without life there can be no morality whatever. And then the principle of goodness, because it is the ultimate principle of any moral systems. Both are logically and empirically prior to the other three principles. The second category, principle of justice and fairness, because in most human actions, more than just one person is involved, and some form of distribution of goodness and badness must be established. The principle of truth-telling and honesty, because it follows from the need to be fair and just in one's dealings with others. And then the principle of individual freedom, because each individual is the only one truly able to decide what is good for him or herself. In the second, the first was the general category, the second is the particular. Priority is determined only by referring to the actual situation or context in which moral actions or decisions occur. The situation or context is important because morality always occurs in particular situations to particular people, never in the abstract, always in the real. And we must start from a broad yet humanly applicable near absolute principle so that there will be some basis for acting morally and avoiding immorality. Humanitarian ethics is an eclectic approach, a mixed deontological or combined consequentialist, non-consequentialist, and act rule approach to morality. Now, how did these two moral issues hold up under the five principles? Well, Thoreau asks specific questions regarding living together before marriage and rape. And this is an exercise that we normally conduct in the classroom. Now, I'd like you to consider that. How do those two moral issues hold up under the five principles? Living together before marriage and rape. Think about it, jot down your responses, and then see how you can make your own moral system work. Now, the five principles together constitute what Thoreau has designated humanitarian ethics, and it allows for diversity and variety in the context of stability and rationality. That's how he is able to make them work. He comes up with those five principles out of everything that we've discussed, and he has dubbed this humanitarian ethics. Now, you can adopt this for yourself, or you can alter it. You can change it depending on what is important for you. Again, you've got to find a way to separate, reason and emotion. Is something important because it touches you in some way, or is it important because you can justify it rationally, or a combination of both? This chapter caps the most difficult section of the textbook. Students complain all the time about, wow, the textbook is so difficult. Those first 7 chapters and then the 8th chapter, which combines the 7 together. After this, we get to hot button issues. The next is, taking of human life and abortion and so on and so forth. But now we're going to be able to take those foundational systems and apply them specifically to hot button topics. It gets a lot more interesting, at least most students think so, after this point. I hope you find this to be the case as well. But that, in a nutshell, is Chapter 8. Again, as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call me or email me. Have a great day.